It's time to learn how to create our very own simple sentences in Spanish. And in order to do that, we need to know our action words. You guessed it, it's time to talk about Spanish verbs. In this lesson, we're going to review how to create simple, descriptive sentences using verbs. And then in the following lesson, I'll give you a list of some of the most common and helpful verbs you will likely use in your work setting. If your Spanish learning experience was anything like mine, your memory of Spanish verbs probably involved a list of verbs you needed to learn for a specific chapter. You probably had to recognize if a verb was AR, ER, or IR, and you probably had to memorize verb conjugation charts that looked like this. Don't worry, we're going to make this all a bit more simple. Remember what this channel is about. It's about making Spanish accessible and usable to beginners like you. So stay with me these next few minutes, and I bet you'll see how we can simplify this so that by the end of this video, you'll see how you can start to do this on your own. Let's start by comparing something that we do know, English verbs, with something that we don't know, Spanish verbs. So in a simple sentence, whether it's in English or Spanish, we have a subject, and we have a verb. And verbs change based on the subject in that sentence. So, for example, in English, with the verb to eat, I could say, I eat, you eat, or he eats. And our verb that means to eat, while it stayed the same for the first person, I, and for the second person, you, it changed for the third person, he. In Spanish, it doesn't just change for the third person, it changes for all of them. So the equivalent of I eat is yo como. You eat is tú comes. And he eats is él come. So in both English and Spanish, the verbs change based on the subject. Or in technical terms, they conjugate in order to agree with the subject. Here's the really nice thing. We don't have to focus on the 6 ways that a verb could change. Because of the nature of our jobs, we can focus primarily on just one of those 6 forms. And that's the way to say, you do this action. When we are in a clinical setting, we are providing our patients with different exercises or activities to complete. Because so much of our communication is us speaking directly to our patients, and because the goal of these lessons is to make Spanish as straightforward and simple as possible, we are going to only focus on one subject, the word that means you. There's 2 ways to say you in Spanish, and that's either tú or usted. And when speaking to patients, we want to be as respectful as we can be. So the word that we will use for you will be the one that is used in a formal setting, and that will be usted. Now, one final piece to understand, and then we'll start making our own simple Spanish sentences. Spanish verbs are categorized based on their endings. These endings are AR, ER, and IR. Knowing that is important because just like how we changed the English verb from I eat to he eats, knowing the ending of the Spanish verb will tell us how to correctly change that verb. Let's look at 3 examples. We have the verbs caminar, correr, and escribir. So of course, caminar is considered an AR verb, correr is considered an ER verb, and escribir is considered an IR verb. Let's start with our AR verb that means to walk, caminar. Step 1 is to identify the ending, which in this case is AR. Step 2 is to remove the ending from the stem. So in this instance, we have the stem, camin, and then we have our ending, which is AR. Next, we remove the AR entirely, and then we replace it with an A, and it becomes this. Now, we put our subject in front of that, and congratulations, you have your first Spanish sentence. Usted camina. You walk. Let's see how we do this with an ER verb, like the verb correr, which means to run. Our subject is still usted, which again is the polite, formal way to say you to someone in Spanish. First, let's identify our verb. Based on the last two letters, we see that correr is an ER verb. Next, we are going to separate our stem from our ending. So correr becomes cor and er. We are then going to remove the ending, the ER, and we replace it with an E. So this becomes this. We place our subject back in front, usted, and we've created a new sentence, usted corre, or you run. Okay, you're probably looking at these and going, all right, why are you removing the ending entirely and not just the final R? Well, that's because of the final verb type that's coming up, the IR verb. And I think it's easier to learn one universal rule that you can apply to all verbs rather than learning numerous rules that can only work sometimes. So let's look at our final verb. Our last verb we're going to work with is escribir, which means to write. As usual, we are going to first identify our verb, and then based on the ending, we can tell that this is an IR verb. So let's separate our stem from our ending, and we have this. Our next step is to replace the ending, and we replace it with the letter E. So escribir now becomes this. We put our subject back in front, and we have our simple sentence. Usted escribe, or you write. That's a lot. And that's about the highest degree of complication that we're going to deal with here for our beginner lessons. Congrats first on making it this far. Learning a new language is difficult, and to stick through it even to this point is no simple task. So really, job well done. Let's take a look at all that we just did and review it in its most simple form. Step 1, we identify the ending of a verb. Is it AR, ER, or IR? Step 2, identify the subject. In this case, we are using usted, which means you. Step 3, we separate the ending from the stem. And step 4, we replace the ending with the appropriate letter. So for AR, we replace it with A. With ER, we replace it with E. And with IR, we also replace it with E. And then step 5, we place the subject in front of the verb. Let's do one more example of each verb, now quickly, to lock it in. So for our first verb, saltar, this means to jump. So we take our verb saltar and we separate the stem from the ending. Next, we replace that ending with an A, and then we put that back together and we have salta. We put our subject in front of it, usted, and we have usted salta, or you jump. With our ER verb, aprender, that means to learn. We then separate our stem from our ending, and then after that, we remove our ending and we replace it with an E. We put that all together and we put usted in front of it, and we now have usted aprende. You learn. And lastly, we have subir. We recognize that subir is an IR verb. We then take our verb subir and we separate the stem from the ending. We replace that IR with an E, and we have sube. We put usted back in front of it, and we have usted sube. You go up. You ascend. Now, your final questions may be this. How do I change the verb if the subject is someone besides you, usted? There is a way, and it builds off of this step-by-step path which we've just reviewed. However, it involves being able to remember additional endings. So we won't do that in this lesson. I certainly can and will create a future lesson if you want to make sentences where you say, for example, I walk or we walk instead of just you walk. But in the meantime, start with this. This is complex enough, and I think it's best to master this first before you begin adding more complications. What we've learned here is how to create a descriptive sentence. We're creating sentences describing what we want a patient to do. So it's very basic. And while it may look like a command and could be used as a command, technically what I'm teaching right now is not that. But we're building up to that. What we have currently is a place to start, a place to create sentences to describe what you want to see from your patients. And with what you've learned from this lesson, you could begin speaking directly to your patients. So if you needed your patients to stretch, to move a muscle, to get out of bed, to sit in a chair, you could express that with these descriptive sentences. Usted estira la pierna? You stretch your leg? Usted mueve el brazo? You move your arm. Usted gira la cabeza a la derecha. You turn your head to the right. All you have to do is look up the verb you want to use in Spanish, and then once you have, go through those 5 verb conjugation steps. This applies if the verb is a regular verb. And thankfully, the majority of verbs are regular verbs. But there are other categories of verbs. And in a future lesson, we will have to go over those to understand what we're going to need to do. As for now, we're going to start to look forward to the next lesson, which are common clinical verbs. Let's do a quick review so you have this. With regular verbs, we have a 5-step process to change the verb to agree with the subject and make a simple descriptive sentence. Step 1, we identify the ending. Is it AR, ER, or IR? Step 2, we identify the subject. In our case, we are using usted because it is the formal, polite way to say you. Step 3, separate the ending from the stem. Step 4, replace the ending with the appropriate letter. AR is replaced with an A, ER is replaced with an E, and IR is replaced with an E. Step 5, place the subject in front of the verb, and you have your simple descriptive sentence. So again, I can't thank you enough for sticking through this with me to the end. We've learned how to recognize the 3 verb categories, and we've learned how to make each of those verbs change to agree with the subject, usted, which is the formal way to say you in Spanish. We've learned to do this through those 5 steps that I gave you, and through that we created original simple sentences. So head over to the next lesson. We're going to focus on some of the most common verbs that you're likely to see with your patients. But first, go outside. Take a walk. Take a break from Spanish. This is a lot. I will see you there.